We are gearing up for the next big Ethereum upgrade, Pectra, which will happen in 2 steps in 2025. The first step will happen in Q1. It will include a giant leap for user experience. It's called the EIP 7702 and will allow for massive proliferation of smart accounts. But what I want to focus on today is on the next step, which will likely happen at the end of 2025. The second step of Pectra will include a long-awaited feature for scalability, PeerDAS, or EIP 7594. But before we talk about PeerDAS, let's take a step back to understand what it is really impacting. Back in March 2024, we had a change in the Ethereum protocol with the EIP 4844. This EIP, also known as proto-down sharding, has included a new form of data storage inside the Ethereum blockchain. We call it the blob. The Ethereum node that are participating to the staking of Ethereum, they run a beacon chain node, are also storing the data from layer 2 and layer 3 potentially. It's a new form of data that you can store inside Ethereum and that your node, if you are a staker, is storing. This data is supposed to be short-lived. Your node is supposed to discard this data after a few weeks. Just enough time for any security requirement or any bridging out of a layer 2 to be happening in a perfect secure setup. Thanks to the blobs, the layer 2s are able to store the extra data that they are producing for a short period of time inside the beacon chain nodes. Thus, they are not posting this data on the layer 1 and not paying too much in terms of fees for the security of their layers. Meanwhile, if you are a layer 2 user, you are able to transact at a very low fee because the data that the layer 2 is paying at the end of the day is lower thanks to the proto-down sharding or EIP 4844. So here comes PeerDAS. PeerDAS is a fancy name for peer-to-peer data availability sampling. It's a huge innovation that's going to allow for way less data stored at the beacon chain node and still the same amount of security. What do we mean by data availability sampling? Data availability sampling is an old and battle-tested way to retrieve data. You may have already experienced it firsthand, by the way, if you ever touched a Laserdisc. We've been looking for a Laserdisc in the studio, but we couldn't find one. Looks like it's really an old technology, right? So a Laserdisc, it can have scratches, it can have a few rough edges, it can have some scratches that eventually would potentially prevent your player to read the Laserdisc. Yet, thanks to data availability sampling, your Laserdisc reader is able to evaluate what the data is in order to give you the song you are supposed to listen to or to give you access to the video game that is installed on the Laserdisc despite all the scratches on the Laserdisc. And this is exactly what we are going to do with the blobs. We are going to make the data of the blobs available despite the fact that not all the nodes are going to be storing the blobs. So how does it work in practice in the Ethereum blockchain? If you're running an Ethereum node, you're going to be storing a few blobs and a few pieces of blobs. And the Ethereum protocol is going to require your node to randomly give a sample of the blobs it is storing. And we are going to make sure at the protocol level that the entirety of the blobs is globally in a peer-to-peer manner available, even if all the nodes are not storing the whole blobs themselves. Thus, what you can expect is much lower bandwidth on your Ethereum staking nodes and potentially more space for blobs and thus lower fees on upper layers of Ethereum. Pectra V2, here comes the PeerDAS.